Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime with Mystery Maverick. I'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to my viewers and subscribers. It takes a lot of time and research to present my content, and your patience and support spurs me on to continue. If you haven't been here before and want to know the full details of the Routier case, you have come to the right place. You can also visit the amazing RJP podcast for more in-depth discussions where I am a guest host along with people who know Darlie and are well versed in the case. On a less lighter note, if you have come here to harass or insult me, my viewers, or Darlie's family, then this is not the channel for you. Remember, they are the victims, not you. We cannot possibly fathom the pain and the heartache these people have suffered, losing Devon and Damon, two innocent beautiful boys, and losing a daughter, mother, sister, wife and friend. In this multi-part episode we return to Texas and we travel to Kerr County. I will take you inside the courtroom of Darlie's capital murder trial, where I will examine, analyse and debunk the evidence brought against her, as we continue to unravel the mystery, dying for justice, the wrongful conviction of Darlie Routier. It was the end of November 1996 when a jury of 7 men and 5 women from Kerville was selected to serve their civic duty in the capital murder trial of Darlie Lynn Routier. Previously refused bond, Darlie had sat in a cell in a Dallas County jail awaiting her chance to prove her innocence once and for all. After all, she didn't do it, so she knew the evidence would show that the police had got it wrong. In an interview for the documentary Waiting for a Miracle, Darlie stated, "I believed that when you walked into a courtroom, if you were innocent, you would be found innocent. If you were guilty, you'd be found guilty. That's not the truth all the time. That's not the way it worked." Darlie's trial would arrive sooner than anyone could imagine. Less than 2 months after jury selection and 6 months after her arrest, Darlie would stand trial in Kerville County Courthouse. In the book Dateline Purgatory, Kenneth, the husband of Darlie's close friend Melanie Waits, stated that the state had sped the trial up and that Darlie's attorneys did little to slow it down. He recalled that even Darlie's family were fine with a speedy trial too, their reasoning being the sooner the trial was over, the sooner they would have Darlie home. This further supports the fact that the family and Darlie knew little about the criminal justice system and even less about capital murder trials. On an episode of The Last Defense, Darlie's original state-appointed attorney Doug Parks said, "Darlie's trial had been set for the first Monday after January, so we had 6 months. I typically find that it's hard to be ready for a death penalty case in less than a year and a half. It was going to be quick, there's no question about it." Moreover, Parks had been replaced by Mulder, who had only been appointed to the case in October at the same time as jury selection, which meant he had even less time to prepare. An unimaginable challenge, considering a woman's life was on the line. On the first weekend of January, Darlie was transferred from Dallas to Kerville County Jail in anticipation of her trial. Family and friends took up lodgings nearby in a rental property, and court officials booked into local hotels, while others sought accommodation closer to the interstate highway. On the morning of the trial, the weather was unusually cold as an Arctic cold front swept in from the northwest. This did not make the temperature inside the courtroom comfortable for anyone, not least because the heating was on the blink. Nevertheless, the trial would commence, even if it meant attendees needed to layer up for warmth. Outside the courtroom, reporters would approach Darlie Key and ask her, "How are you feeling today?" "I feel great. First day of the truth," she replied. A confident Mulder further added, "We're here to win." Although Darlie was initially indicted for the murder of both her sons, The prosecution decided to only try her for Damon's murder. At the time, Damon's murder had qualified for the death penalty as a child under the age of 6. However, it has been further speculated that this was a legal manoeuvre to guarantee Darlie's conviction by loading up a double-barreled shotgun. Therefore, if Darlie was found not guilty of Damon's murder, they could try her again for Devon's. So on the 6th of January 1997 at 9:30 AM in Kerr County Courthouse, the capital murder trial of Darlie Lynn Routier would begin. Outside the presence of the jury, Darlie was arraigned. Lead prosecutor Greg Davis would first read the grand jury indictment before the court as follows. The defendant, on or about the 6th day of June 1996 in the county of Dallas, and said state did unlawfully then and there, intentionally and knowingly cause the death of Damon Christian Routier, an individual hereinafter called the deceased, by stabbing said Damon Christian Routier with a knife, and the deceased was at the time of the offence under 6 years of age, against the peace and dignity of the state. The judge asked how the defendant pleads, to which Darlie replied, "Not guilty." This was followed by some other motions brought before the court. Of most salience was the request by the defence for a continuance of a day and a half to review all the evidence. Second chair on Darlie's defence, Richard Mosty, said to the court on the subject, "The second part of the motion for continuance is that we have that the evidence has been at various places, the District Attorney's Office, the Rowlett PD, Swift's, Jean's Green, various places, and Mr. Douglas and Mr. Harrell went up last week to look at that, and they weren't able to look at all of the evidence even. Some of it was being put together to be moved down here, so presumably all of the evidence is here now. I think it came in on the 2nd, so we need 1 day or part of a day to examine all the evidence that the state has down here, which we have not had that opportunity to do up to this time. Additionally, leading up to the trial, the state had ordered further DNA testing on Darlie's nightshirt, and the results had not yet come in, giving the defence no time to evaluate or review the results. Sherry Wallace from the prosecution team had gone off to call them for the results, and when she had returned revealed that the samples were all Darlie's blood. This clearly exposed the issues that came with a rushed trial, which added to the unpreparedness of the defence team, which further hindered their ability to adequately defend their client. In fact, documents show that Davis had only written to Mulder on the 17th of December offering access to some of the evidence, just weeks before the trial. Nevertheless, Toll denied the motion for continuance. The defence had further requested that Swifts and Rowlett PD provide contact sheets related to the crime scene and evidence to distinguish where and when, in which sequence the crime scene photos were taken. Subsequently, Davis would reveal that neither organisation used contact sheets. This, among other failures, showed the lack of appropriate procedures used at the crime scene, particularly as items had been moved around. According to the book Hush Little Babies, the trial was delayed for a short while as one of the jurors had gone AWOL and had been found sitting in the audience. Instead of being sequestered, the juror had seen the preliminaries they were not supposed to see. Regardless, they were reunited with the other 11 jurors, sworn in, and the trial would commence. The trial began like most other criminal trials, with the prosecution's opening statement, a telling piece that would perhaps foreshadow the direction of things to come. Davis would launch a 16-minute-long tirade of defamatory remarks against Darlie's personal character. Despite the reading of the indictment only referring to the murder of Damon, Davis constantly mentioned both boys' murders throughout the trial. He told the court that the evidence would show how the boys were murdered, who murdered them, and why. He proceeded to tell the jury that Darlie was a self-centered, materialistic and cold woman, quote, cold enough to kill her own 2 children. He described Darren as a hard worker whose wife was living a lavish lifestyle beyond their means. While he admitted that the couple was still doing well financially in 1996, that it was the birth of the couple's 3rd child, Drake, that had changed the dynamics at 5801 Eagle Drive. On top of that, the fact that Darlie was struggling to lose the baby weight she had gained, which resulted in her turning to diet pills. He further went on to say that Darren's business had started to, quote, flatten out as the year began. He painted Darlie as a depressed, attention-seeking person whose kids were taking up too much of her time, and further suggested that the lifestyle she had become accustomed to was slipping away, which made her very angry. He said that the couple had no savings, no retirement fund, and very little money in the bank, and that they had been turned down for a loan just days before the murders. He stated that Darlie had orchestrated the crime by sleeping downstairs with the 2 boys before stabbing them to death while they slept. He went on to say there was no intruder in the home that night, and that Darlie had inflicted deep wounds on the boys before inflicting superficial wounds on herself and staging the crime scene. He said the evidence would show that the knife was not dropped on the floor of the utility room, and that fibres from the screen found on a bread knife from a butcher block inside the home would show it was used to cut the window screen in the garage as part of the staging. He ended by saying that the evidence would show beyond any reasonable doubt that she is guilty of the capital murder of her 5-year-old son Damon Routier. Next up was the defence opening statement made by Second Chair Richard Mosty. He started by reminding the jury that the reading of the indictment was not evidence of guilt. He told them that statements made by Darlie, whom was traumatised by seeing her children die and having her own throat slit, were also not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He said the couple were young and starting to make a successful life for themselves. He said that life revolved around the 3 children and that various child-focused items in and around the home suggested that. He said that Darlie's life in particular revolved around her children, and that friends and family and neighbours would all testify to that. He further questioned the state's logic that a doting and loving mother would turn into a psychotic killer in the blink of an eye. He further added that she did not only turn into a psychotic killer, but also a forensic expert, such that she could stage a whole crime scene too. He said that the evidence of Darlie's wounds would show that they were defensive in nature and not self-inflicted as the state would suggest. He further stated that the prosecution had failed to mention a sock found 75 yards down an alleyway behind the Routier home with both boys' blood on it. He further suggested it was ridiculous to think she had run down the alleyway to plant the sock. He said that the evidence would show that from 6 a.m. in the morning, police had focused on Darlie. They ignored any evidence pointing away from her, including several reports about a black car seen around the area on the night of the crime that had not been followed up, and they had failed to identify it to this day. He pointed to the state's evidence and suggested that their theory had changed several times. They kept going back to the crime scene and conducted additional testing to fit their ever-changing theories, which were all focused on Darlie as the perpetrator. He further suggested that the state's interpretation of the evidence, such as the mulch outside the cut screen and dust undisturbed on the windowsill, were false conclusions considering the placement and size of the window. Perhaps the most chilling part of the defence opening statement was when Mosty stated to the court, "The true murderer is still on the streets." Day 1 of the trial was not going to be an easy day for anyone in the courtroom, not least for Darlie, who had to relive the horrifying night her boys were murdered in the most graphic way. The first witness called with the state were the medical examiners Janice Townsend Parchment and Dr. Joni McLean. According to the book Hush Little Babies, this testimony was accompanied with grisly autopsy photos, which were passed around the jury, and when Darlie caught a glimpse, she had grimaced and turned away. Dr. Joni McLean had carried out the autopsy on Darlie Routier. In heartbreaking testimony, she described receiving Devon's body wearing Power Ranger shorts, along with a Power Ranger pillowcase and blanket. She said that Devon weighed 46 pounds and measured 46 inches, a little under 4 feet tall. He had suffered 4 sharp force injuries, which she described in detail alongside a video depicting each wound. She said that the mechanism of death was blood loss, and he would have died within a few minutes, up to 5 minutes after his injuries were inflicted. Wound 1 was a stab wound to the upper left chest and went between the 4th and 5th ribs and went through the pulmonary artery, the right lobe of the lung, and perforated the right posterior chest between the posterior 7th and 8th ribs. The wound penetrated 5 inches, and all the wounds went from front to back, left to right, with no up or down deviation. She further noted that on wound 1 there was a sharp and a blunt angle that suggested to her that a single-edged blade had been used to inflict this wound. McLean said that due to the child's ribs being softer because they had more cartilage than an adult's, that it wouldn't take much force to inflict the wounds to the chest. Wound 2 was another stab wound, slightly lower on the chest and penetrated 2.5 inches and went through the right 8th rib and right intercostal muscle and went into the right lung. Wound 3 was an incise wound to the left forearm and was 1 1/4 inches in length with an estimated penetration of 1/8 of an inch. Wound 4 was a stab wound 1.5 inches into the left midline of the left leg. The wound was 3/4 of an inch in length and 3/4 of an inch penetration. When asked by the prosecution if Devon could have made a noise after receiving those stab wounds, the doctor said that it was possible and that his wounds would not have precluded him from doing so. She further estimated that Devon would have survived no longer than 5 minutes after his injuries were inflicted. Under cross-examination, Dr. McLean said that she could only determine that one of the wounds were inflicted with a single-edged knife, and that a double-edged knife could not be ruled out in the 3 other wounds. She conceded that she could not say with certainty that all the injuries were caused with the same instrument. In addition, only Darlie and Damon's blood was found on the knife, which could indicate that a second weapon was used. However, as only 4 samples were taken from the knife, it is possible that the testing was not thorough enough to find it. She concluded that there was no way to tell in which order the wounds were inflicted. She further added that a determination could not be made on either the width or the length of the knife used to inflict the wounds. She explained that this was due to the lines of languor and the loosening of the skin tissue on the surface. Therefore, the only conclusions that can be made is the depth the knife had penetrated the body, which is not an accurate measurement of the size of the knife used. Under redirect, she said that the knife in question, State's Exhibit number 67, could have been used to inflict wounds 1 and 2, and there was nothing to exclude it from being the murder weapon. However, under recross, she said that although it was a possibility, she could not say it was the knife used, just that it was consistent. She went on to say that she had been asked by investigators to look for previous signs of child abuse. She admitted that Devon was a good weight for a boy of his age. She found no broken bones or healing wounds or any signs of previous injury besides the wounds that caused his death. She concluded that she did not find any signs of child abuse. This was also true for Damon, and a subject we will return to later in the series when we look at filicide research. It was the state's contention that Devon was stabbed by Darlie and died where he lay sleeping. There are several physical clues at the crime scene and autopsy that debunk this notion. If we look at the position of Devon's pillow, it is facing towards the television, which is where Darren said he was positioned when he had last seen him the evening before. However, Devon's body was found lying face up with his feet towards the sofa Darlie was sleeping on. Moreover, the blood pattern down the front of Devon's shorts flows down the front towards his feet and towards the ground, meaning when he was bleeding, he was in an upright position. It has been speculated that the blood on his shorts came about through Darren's attempts at CPR. However, Darren testified that blood spurted out of his chest, which would have created a spatter or cast-off pattern. We see on Devon's shorts saturation of blood, and the flow indicating blood was running for a period of time down the front of his shorts. Furthermore, I believe that if Devon was on the carpet, he would have some scrapes or marks to his back. Additionally, there were no defects in Devon's comforter, and none of the fibres found on the knife belonged to the comforter. On the contrary, both fibres from Darlie's nightshirt and from Damon's t-shirt were found on the murder weapon, further indicating the possibility of a second weapon and even a second perpetrator. Let us look at the angles of Devon's wounds. For Darlie to have stabbed him lying down, she would have had to have stood on or aside his left leg and arm and twisted her body over to the left. His wounds went front to back, left to right, with no up or down deviation. Darlie would have needed to lean to her left in an unnatural angle and stabbed at a slight angle. A video created by blood spatter expert Tom Bevel, who would later testify for the state, shows him reenacting a stabbing motion to create blood patterns on the shirt. He suggested that to achieve the blood patterns on the shirt, that she would be standing over him stabbing in a clean front to back stabbing motion. How do you get an angled stab wound from a straight on stab? This was a criticism of blood spatter analysis later mentioned by Dr. DeMayo, that it does not consider the different types of wounds, the difference between individual people and circumstances of events. Darren stated he was blowing into Devon's chest and blood had sprayed out. He said that while he was doing this, Darlie had brought a towel over to Devon and was trying to hold his wounds close. Where was she when you were blowing into his mouth? Right over the top of him. What was she doing? She was trying to stop the bleeding. She was trying to hold his chest together. Many have speculated that this was a lie made up by Darren prior to trial to cover for Darlie. However, according to Larry Byford, the EMT that rode with Darlie to the hospital, he recalled Darlie telling him she had given CPR to one of the boys. You've told us about the defendant's comments about when are we going to get to the hospital. Do you recall her making any other statements, or was she relatively quiet on the way down there? She had remarked once about doing CPR on one of the boys. Neither Darlie nor Darren knew that Darlie was a suspect at this point, and had no clue about the state's case. How could they preempt such a lie? Darlie further mentioned in her first written statement that she had put a towel on Damon's back. However, she did not go into detail about wetting towels or her first aid attempts. Again, it is likely that this seemed insignificant to the Routiers at the time, that they were unaware that the police were looking at Darlie as a suspect. After all, bloody towels were strewn all over the crime scene. Surely they did not need to explain them. Also, with everything that happened, their own CPR attempts were the least of their worries. In addition, they had never been asked or prompted by police or investigators in regards to the towels or the kitchen sink. We further see that this is because investigators were forming their own theories and were not attempting to corroborate Darlie's version of events with the physical evidence at the crime scene. The state suggested that Darlie did nothing to help the boys as they lay dying, and that she stayed by the kitchen bar tending to her own wounds. However, the state's own DNA testing found that both Darlie's and Devon's blood on Devon's pillow, meaning Darlie was actively bleeding around Devon. This further supports Darlie's account that she had been given aid to Devon while she herself was actively bleeding, which was further confirmed in Darlie Routier's later testimony when he described Darlie running back and forth between the boys with towels. On a post-trial episode of the Lisa Gibbons show on Darlie's case, juror Rena Way, amongst many other ignorant and bizarre comments, claimed that Devon received the wound on the back of his leg when he was, quote, lying on his back kicking the crap out of her. This comment is not only ignorant, but it makes no logical sense. Devon had no other knife wounds on his lower body or his feet. If Devon was so-called kicking the crap out of Darlie as she was stabbing him, his defensive wounds would have been present in that area. By contrast, Devon's defensive wound was on his arm, more consistent with him being in an upright position when considering that the arm wound was said to be related to chest wound 1. A fact further confirmed by Janice Townsend Parchment when she spoke of the nature of defensive wounds. They're also seen on the forearms. Sometimes if the person winds up essentially fighting off the assailant with his or her legs, you'll see them on the feet and the lower legs. Moreover, the single wound to the back of Devon's leg has rounded edges and signs of hemorrhaging around the entrance, which indicates blunt force trauma from an object that broke the skin. It is common that these types of injuries can be miscategorized due to the fact that they can appear like stab wounds. When looking at the crime scene, the only item that has a sharp enough edge to create this type of wound is the glass table. Darren said in his earlier police statement that the table was knocked over. We further see from the crime scene photos that the glass table is not in line with the base, which indicates that someone had placed the glass back onto the base in a haphazard way. This was also confirmed in Darren's later trial testimony. When asked about the table, he said, "Where was the table? The table was completely down. It was fallen. The flowers had completely fallen off the table." When asked if the table was just slightly askew, Darren reiterated that the tabletop was off the base. No, it wasn't on its base. It was completely down to the ground. He further added that the paramedic who had tended to Devon had moved the top back onto the base to make room to give him first aid. In addition, we see blood, which was later revealed to be Darlie's, had rolled down the table, indicating the table was turned over while Darlie was bleeding. The table is on the right side of Darlie as she got up, and her arm was already bleeding considerably at this time. The state further contended that Darlie had knocked the table over as part of the staging. However, if Darlie was already bleeding when she staged the table, there would have been far more blood, bloody smears, and even Darlie's bloody fingerprints. Instead, we see the blood had hit the table and is dripping down the tabletop. Considering this evidence, it is more probable that the glass table had been knocked over, and it is my belief it occurred during the struggle as Devon had gotten up to go to Darlie on the sofa. Next up to testify was Janice Townsend Parchment, who had carried out Damon Routier's autopsy and had inspected Darlie's wounds at the hospital at the request of the Rowlett PD. She recalled that she only received Damon's body along with the t-shirt that had been cut away with one or more defects. However, she could not remember if the defects were on the front or the back of the garment. She stated that Damon weighed 40 pounds and measured 43 inches in length. He had suffered 6 wounds, including 4 stab wounds and 2 incise wounds, which she also described in detail, along with photos and videos of the autopsy. Wound 1 was an incised wound which measured 1/8 of an inch in depth. Wound 2 was another incised wound that measured 3/4 of an inch in depth. Wound 1 was a stab wound which perforated the left 8th rib and the left 7th intercostal muscle and penetrated the lung. Wound 2 was another stab wound which went through the right 8th rib and into the intercostal muscle and penetrated the lung 3/4 of an inch. Wound 3 was a stab wound that went through the 8th intercostal muscle between the right 8th and 9th ribs and was 1 7/8 of an inch. Wound 4 was another stab wound going through the intercostal musculature, through the right lung, the diaphragm, and into the liver with a max depth of penetration of 3 inches. She testified that Damon's wounds were consistent with a single-edged knife with 1 sharp edge and 1 blunt edge. She went on to say that the butcher knife was consistent with the injuries inflicted on Damon. She further stated that his wounds would have oozed rather than gushed blood, as no major blood vessels were cut. She stated that Damon would not have died instantly, and that he could have walked 10 to 15 feet after all 4 stab wounds had been inflicted. She conceded that he would also have been able to make noise, and that it is not until significant blood loss occurs that a person loses consciousness. Until such a time they are still able to move around and make noise. She conceded that Damon could have survived as much as 8 to 9 minutes. When asked if the kitchen knife was consistent with Damon's injuries, she said that it could not be ruled out and that it was consistent with the wounds. However, under cross-examination, she said that the wounds could also be consistent with several other knives, including pocket knives, buck knives, and kitchen knives. She explained that this was because the portion of the blade can be less than the wound tract left behind. She further acknowledged that it can also be dependent on motion, the motion of the body in addition to the motion of the knife, and conceded that Damon's injuries could have been inflicted with a much smaller knife or instrument. She went on to say that there was no way of knowing if all the wounds were inflicted with the same instrument or if they were inflicted by the same perpetrator. Greg Davis took this opportunity to try and purport the theory that Damon had been stabbed first as he lay asleep, and then again when he had reached the hallway where he was found. After all, how would they explain the sock down the alleyway with both Devon and Damon's blood on it, and reconcile it with the 9-minute upper limit time frame given by the medical examiner? Darlie was on the phone to 911 for over 5 minutes, which could give Darlie but a few minutes to run 75 yards down the alleyway to drop the sock, run back to the house another 75 yards, slit the screen in the garage, put the knife back in the knife block, slit her own throat, stab herself in the arm twice, once to the bone, making other scrapes, marks and scratches on her body, smashed the wine glass on the floor without taking it out of the wine rack, cleaning up the kitchen sink but leaving blood all over it, throwing over the hoover, turning over the glass table, and calling Darren. Furthermore, the prosecution's theory does not consider that if Damon was not mortally wounded at this point, he would have been able to go to get help with Darren, or even possibly gone out into the street whilst Darlie was away from the house. Which begs the question, if Darlie had stabbed the boys, why leave Damon alive when calling 911? Jack Colby, the paramedic who attended to Damon at the scene, said that he saw the light fade in his eyes after working on him for 2 minutes inside the home, which was after the 911 call had ended. This would leave Darlie around a minute to do all the above, which is physically impossible even with the prosecution's theory that Damon was stabbed a second time. It would only give her an extra minute, which again is impossible. This was, as mostly said in the opening statement, a part of the state's ever-changing theory to try and make the evidence fit. When asked by the prosecution if the wounds could have been inflicted at a separate time, she stated that it was possible. However, under recross, she stated that there was nothing to suggest that the wounds had been inflicted at different times. There was really no way of knowing. This was just one example of the prosecution's use of speculation and wild theories that were unsupported and ungrounded in fact or physical evidence. While we cannot tell from the autopsy whether Damon was attacked in separate locations, we can look at whether the physical evidence at the crime scene supports this. If we look at the area where Damon was found, it is close to a wall, meaning if Damon had been stabbed a second time at this location, there should be evidence of cast-off or signs of a struggle in that area. The only blood found on that wall was higher up, and that was Darlie's as she switched on the light once she was already bleeding significantly, which further supports her account that after picking up the knife, she went back to the family room and turned on the light. Damon's blood was not found on the light switch. If Darlie had stabbed him next to the wall, we should see a mixture of both Darlie's and Damon's blood on the light switch. The perpetrator would likely have the victim's blood at least on their dominant hand. Darlie would likely have transferred Damon's blood to both the light switch and the knife handle had she been the one who had stabbed him. DNA analyst Caroline Van Winkle testified that the handle contained a possible mixture of Darlie and one of the boys' blood. However, her DNA report states that Darlie's blood was the only blood found on the knife handle. Once again, the investigators were trying to collect evidence to fit their theory. Instead, their own DNA testing did little to incriminate Darlie, and in fact supports Darlie's recollection of events. Many social media commentators that believe in Darlie's guilt have further questioned whether Damon could have even walked at all to where he was found, disqualifying the obvious that Damon was found some feet from where he originally lay, indicating he walked to where he was found. There are several other clues that refute this. If we look at Damon's injuries along with the jeans he was wearing, we see again, just like Devon's shorts, there is blood that runs down the back of Damon's jeans to the point of saturation, meaning that Damon was in an upright position for a period of time whilst he was actively bleeding. The first responding officer, David Waddle, stated that Damon was laying on the floor by the wall when he arrived at the scene. In addition, there was a bloody child's handprint in Damon's blood found in the family room in the area where Damon had fallen asleep, which indicates that Damon had gotten up after he was already stabbed and bleeding. This was further confirmed by Toby Shook on an episode of Death Row Stories. The youngest one put down a bloody handprint in the carpet to help himself up. Several DNA samples also revealed that Darlie was bleeding in the same area at the same time as Damon. Darlie's blood was found on both the front and back of Damon's jeans, and both Damon's and Darlie's blood was found on the couch that Darlie had slept on and in the area Damon had gone to sleep. This supports Darlie's version of events and further shows that Darlie was close to Damon and that she had tried to help her boys as she herself was severely injured and actively bleeding. Dr. Townsend Parchment went on to say that she had taken and sent blood samples to the top floor criminal investigations lab for analysis. She further stated that although she took Damon's footprints, she did not take his fingerprints or palm impressions. a detail that would become of great importance in relation to the forensic evidence at the crime scene, and more importantly, in showing the presence of an intruder and thus supporting Darlie's claims of innocence. She claimed that the reason she did not take fingerprints is because they do not usually take them at such a young age. However, in one photo we see that Devon's left hand was bagged by the coroners, and Damon's hands were also bagged at the hospital. Victims' hands are bagged to preserve possible crucial forensic evidence, particularly in a close contact attack. Why would you go to the effort of preserving evidence if you are not going to test it? In addition, the investigators knew that they had a bloody fingerprint found on a coffee table behind the north end sofa of the family room. It would have been their job to request the doctor take the fingerprints of the boys for comparison purposes. This further shows that either they had already made up their minds that Darlie was guilty, or they were inexperienced in homicide and crime scene investigation, or both. The defence did not ask if she took any nail scrapings, something I would expect would be of particular interest in that the boys were murdered in a close contact attack, and there may have been DNA evidence of the perpetrator left behind. Similarly, they did not take fingernail scrapings from Darlie. Patterson had claimed at the bond hearing that Darlie did not have any nails, so he did not attempt to take any. However, fingernail scrapings are taken from underneath the free edge of the nail and can be found even under very short nails. Darlie had said that she was in a struggle with the suspect, again making it a possibility that she had some of the perpetrator's DNA underneath her fingernails. Rich Prater asked Darlie about this on a visit to Gatesville. She stated that they did take fingernail scrapings, but she did not hear of any testing or results relating to the sample. This further points to the fact that the investigators were not looking for an intruder and therefore felt they did not need to run the appropriate tests that would be carried out in any other homicide case. It has been reported by many over the years that Devon was stabbed all the way through his body. However, neither boy had any exit wounds, which completely debunks the statement made by first responding officer Waddell in an interview with Werner Herzog for the documentary On Death Row. They were stabbed hard enough to where the knife went through their body and actually chipped the concrete floor underneath them, he said. This has further been echoed by prosecutor Toby Shook on an episode of Death Row Stories when describing Devon's injuries. He stated, 6-year-old Darlie Routier had 2 devastating wounds to his chest. They went completely through his body. He was impaled by a large knife. While some of the boys' wounds were indeed deep, there is no evidence in the autopsy to support these statements. This raises the question as to the motive of the prosecutors and law enforcement in this case. Is it just Chinese whispers where a story becomes more exaggerated or completely different over time? Or is it a deliberate attempt to distort the truth and perpetuate the narrative of Darlie as the folk devil, the worst of the worst, a mother who killed her own flesh and blood in the most brutal way? One of the main tenets of the state's case against Darlie was that while the boys' injuries were deep and penetrating, Darlie's were superficial surface wounds. They called several witnesses to show that Darlie's wounds were not only superficial, but that she herself had inflicted them. To be continued.